Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I am most pleased to welcome you to the 10th and final week of our special series titled Hot Talk, Debate for a New Age. In this series, we've had a number of very, very important issues, and we've attempted to bring to you positions, both pro and con, on the question. As we end this series, we're so pleased to introduce to you in a moment our senior U.S. Senator from Idaho to talk about the Second Amendment and gun ownership as we close out this series. Senator Craig will be coming to us via technology, and after I introduce his background for about 11 minutes, he will address his comments that he did at that symposium on the Popcorn Forum as he was in Washington, D.C., and he communicated to our audience, and we decided to broadcast it here. And following that, we're very pleased to have his regional director with us to discuss further that issue. Our guest, Senator Larry Craig, is serving his third term in the United States Senate from the state of Idaho. Senator Craig serves on the Senate Appropriations Committee, the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, the Senate Special Committee on Aging, the Judiciary Committee, and is chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee. He serves on a number of boards and commissions in the United States, including the Board of Directors of the National Rifle Association. Senator Craig was born in Idaho on a ranch in southern Idaho, which was homesteaded by his family in 1899. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Idaho, where he served as student body president. In 1974, Payette and Washington counties in our state elected Craig to the Idaho Senate, where he served 3 terms before winning in 1980 the race for the U.S. House of Representatives from the 1st Congressional District in our state. He was elected to the United States Senate in 1990, re-elected in 1996, and again in 2002. Senator Craig is married to the former Suzanne Thompson, and they have 2 sons and a daughter. With that introduction, it's a pleasure to share with you what Senator Craig had to say at our symposium in March.
Hello, I'm Senator Larry Craig, and welcome to the Popcorn Forum, North Idaho College. Let me say at the very outset that I am sorry I cannot be there in person. Tony Stewart and I have been friends over the years, and on several occasions, he and you students have provided me with the opportunity to speak to the Popcorn Forum in the spring at North Idaho College, but this is a year when we've worked mightily to bring those schedules together, and I've just simply not been able to accommodate. So for the next few moments, I'm going to visit with you about an issue that I really wish I were there in person, so that there could be the give and take and the questions and the reactions that are always fun and exciting at a good Popcorn Forum discussion. Tony, of course, has picked a topic that I know a good deal about, but one that remains always controversial politically, both here in the United States Senate, in the House, and sometimes it even emerges at the state legislative level. But in Idaho, it is an issue where a substantial majority of the Idaho electorate has always had a very clear point of view on. And that's the issue of Second Amendment rights, or gun rights in our nation, and the issue of gun control, or does the federal government have the right to shape the ownership of, the use of, if you will, a firearm? I always found it very interesting as a student studying government that when our founding fathers crafted a new Constitution, the citizens of that day, listening to the Constitution, said, well, that's all well and good, but if you really want us to ratify it, there are 10 items that you must specifically state within the Constitution are clearly within our rights. Of course, we call that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And you know what that Second Amendment was at that time? The right to own and bear arms. I believe that that right granted at that time by our Constitution was one of those inalienable rights of self-protection and the right of oneself to protect one's property and loved ones. It was called self-protection or self-defense because there was a healthy distrust of government, and in our frontier days it was clearly important that the individual should and must take the initiative of self-protection and property protection. I do not believe that our world has changed so much that we should rely on 911, if you will, and our local law enforcement to be our only protection at a time in which we find ourselves in need of that protection. Once again, Americans believe, as they always have, that it is still the primary responsibility of the individual to protect oneself and one's property. And that is the whole basis, if you will, of the Second Amendment and the strong support that Americans have shown over the years in behalf of Second Amendment rights. Well, down through the years, we've modified it and adjusted it just a little bit. We've said there are types of guns that cannot be owned without special permits and the granting of government authority. But in most all other instances, we have simply shaped the condition or the environment in which guns can be used. But we have never intentionally or outright prohibited the average citizen from owning and using a firearm within these lawful parameters. I have been a strong supporter of these rights since I have been in public life, and as some know, and as Tony might have mentioned in my introduction, I've been on the board of directors of the National Rifle Association since 1982, which is one of the strongest, most outspoken groups in defense of Second Amendment rights. This is an issue that we find debated probably once every 2 or 3 years in the United States Congress. And depending upon where our country is and where our country's mindset is, usually it is an issue that is strongly supported by most. There have been times under which our country stepped back a little bit and said, well, my goodness, we shouldn't allow gun ownership in these circumstances. Immediately following the assassination of President Kennedy, we saw a time in which certain guns were limited and certain gun ownership was prohibited. That law stayed in place for about 2 decades before Americans began to say that that was too much of an infringement upon the rights of average citizens, and over the years that law has slowly drifted away, except for some limits on, again, types of guns, the capacity of a gun to handle a certain type of bullet and other kinds of things. All in all, historically speaking, the average American has said that while we must demand the lawful use of firearms, of course, we cannot take away from the citizen the right to own a firearm. The politics of this has always been very fascinating to me. While in Idaho, my guess is that if you were for gun control and you were anti-Second Amendment, you could probably not be elected, except maybe in 1 or 2 precincts in Boise, Idaho. But the rest of the state would simply say, no, I'm sorry. A majority of us believe in the Second Amendment rights, and we're just simply not going to have a public person representing us who in some way would condition those rights or prohibit them altogether. Now, that has been different in some of our large urban areas that have had to put up with firearms being used in the commission of crimes and high crime rates. But almost in every instance, that's been a situation where either law enforcement broke down or the courts would not enforce the law and they would allow people back to the streets and demonstrated a rather laxness as related to the criminal element. Everywhere law was enforced and gun laws were enforced, in other words, it is illlawful today to use a gun in the commission of a crime, and if you do, and if a prosecutor wants to take you to the limit of the law, they can lock you up for a long time, and if prosecutors do that, the use of guns in the commission of a crime goes down. But in many of our urban areas that grew increasingly liberal over the years in their attitudes and their approach toward crime, firearms were more often used in the commission of a crime, and attitudes changed. The public began to react. Take the guns away from people. They failed to see that law enforcement and the court system of our country was creating a level of lenience that was allowing this to go forward. So that debate continues to go on, and it will today and tomorrow and the next day. And my guess is decades from now, we'll still have public people advocating firearms control, the elimination of ownership, and all of those kinds of things. Interestingly enough, if you look around the world, it happened in Australia not long ago. Prohibition of the ownership of firearms. It happened in Canada. It's happening in other parts of Europe. There is an international movement to largely disarm the citizenry of the world and allow firearms to only be used in the hands of the military and that type of thing. Of course, for any of us who have a healthy mistrust of government and that government can become all-powerful at times, we still will cling to the right of the citizen to defend oneself and one's property, if you will, and, if necessary, against the collective miswill of a government where it gets misused. So that debate continues. Here in the Senate, I will be on the floor in the next month talking about tort reform and the issue of gun liability. There are some that would say that manufacturers that produce firearms and licensed federal firearms dealers that sell firearms ought to be liable when a criminal element uses the firearm in the commission of a crime in which a death occurs. Instead of the criminal being the one liable, many of the trial bar searching for the deep pocket and many liberals trying to bring down gun manufacturers have sought this as a course of action. Last year, we could have passed that legislation, except for some amendments that got attached to it that none of us wanted to see pass, and I brought the legislation down. We believe we may have the votes this year to clearly say, sorry, trial bar, when you're pursuing a criminal element, go after the criminal and not the tool that he or she may use. Again, it's the venue shopping trial bar looking, if you will, to line their pockets and in many instances bring gun manufacturers down that will be in opposition to that statement I've just made. But there's something also extremely valuable, and it relates to national defense and this issue. If you make it unprofitable to manufacture firearms in this country, these are the same companies that manufacture firearms for our military. And so we have our Defense Department contracting with foreign firearms manufacturers, if you will, to build firearms for our men and women in uniform, instead of our own industry doing it to support ourselves and in defense of our country. I guess you can gather by now there are a lot of parameters to this debate, but there is one constant underpinning to the whole. And that is that our founding fathers over 200 years ago said very clearly, American citizens under the Second Amendment have the right to own and bear arms. I believe that is a constitutional right. I believe that is a right of citizenry. And I think it's a right that's going to be around for a long time. And I don't believe it's the right of government to condition that Second Amendment. Our founding fathers were clear. As long as I serve Idaho in the United States Senate, my voice will be loud and I hope very clear as to the certainty of the intent of the Second Amendment and the right of the citizens of the state of Idaho and the nation to live under that valuable amendment. Well, thank you all. I hope I provoked a little debate. And I hope there's both a Second Amendment advocate there and then someone maybe misguided who would want to argue an opposing point of view. That's the value of the Popcorn Forum. That's the value of what Tony Stewart does at North Idaho College. And I hope you've had this all ends up, I guess is a better way of saying, with a rousing debate and discussion on the constitutional rights of American citizens. Thank you all very much.
What you just heard is a presentation by the senior senator from Idaho, Senator Larry Craig, that was recorded in Washington, D.C., and as he shared that with our audience at North Idaho College during March, during our symposium on Hot Talk, Passionate Debate for New Age. We appreciate the senator taking the time to give us that presentation, although he cannot be here in present. And we're sharing it with our television audience later in the summer as we're concluding 10 weeks of this very exciting symposium. And I welcome to the program now John Martin. He is the regional director here in North Idaho for Senator Larry Craig. And John, welcome to the program. I've worked with you on several occasions, and you're very agreeable to meet with us, and we appreciate your time.
Well, I appreciate it, Professor Stewart, and it's a pleasure to be here representing the senator, and I'll do my best to clear up or clarify anything that you may have to ask today.
Well, thank you. I know, John, that you were very much in the forefront of helping us get this recorded and get this as part of our series, both at the symposium and on our television program. There is, as the senator said, there's a great debate in our country about the interpretation of the Second Amendment. And it certainly is addressing the issue of guns and a militia being, when they wrote that in the 1700s. How would you respond to those who take a different position than the senator in saying that it addresses the militia, which today would probably be the National Guard, which is hard to say because at that time it was so different, in relation to ownership of guns?
You know, and that's a good point, Professor Stewart, that many people will look back at the Constitution in the context of the times when it was written and say we can't possibly apply it today because it's a different environment that we're living in. And they say perhaps this reference to a militia means the National Guard, which you said. It's a hard jump to make sometimes. I think the senator says it fairly well on the tape, though. He says it was such an important item that our Constitution wasn't going to be established unless there were these protections for individual rights, which became the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. And those have endured without reinterpretation pretty much the way they are. And so I think the response would be that whether or not, or whatever we may call the militia, that part that deals with bearing arms is for personal liberties and rights and still is applicable today.
And to pursue it just a little bit further, if you look at the history of that time, there was not a standing army like we have today. And militia meant the general population. They gathered in the Revolution to oppose the British, but they were farmers and all coming together. It was a very different concept. And the second question I have is, and I think the senator referred to that in his presentation, in 1791, when we adopted the 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, we've had a lot of debate since then about proposed amendments of them and dealing with a lot of issues. But would the senator take the position that not only the Second Amendment, but all the others, that if you start trying to amend or change it, that it's kind of like the domino theory, what will happen to the entire Bill of Rights?
Well, I'd be a little bit remiss if I didn't say we have to watch out when we use the terms like the domino theory. We'll go back to President Eisenhower in Southeast Asia. But I think the senator and many people who have a Western agenda, which means that we ascribe primary rights to the individual, then to the state, and then finally to the federal government, would say those protections really should be pretty inviolate. On the other hand, you know, the will of the people through the state legislatures is the way that constitutional amendments are done. And if that would eventually go that way, obviously the senator would support them, even if it would be against his personal, philosophy.
When they set up the Bill of Rights, they were, in my view, very wise that it's not a simple majority to change them. If you propose an amendment, it takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and you have to have 3/4 of the states, which is a large number. It's so the chances of changing the Bill of Rights is protected from doing that by having such a large majority. Another issue that he brought up that I hadn't thought of before, and I would get your reaction to it, John, that has to do with this proposal that if someone uses a weapon made by a manufacturer in this country that results in death, you should be able to sue the company. The senator's position in his address was that if you run all the companies out of business, they make weapons also for our military, that we'd be at the mercy of manufacturers in other countries. I hadn't heard that argument before, and so would you like to elaborate upon that?
Well, I think it's fairly clear that the intent of the legislation that's working its way through or will work its way in this session of the Congress is to focus on the criminal, whoever executes the crime using a firearm, rather than going back past a dealer, licensed dealer, to a manufacturer. We don't do that pretty much in any other area. You know, we don't go after a Ford Motor Company if someone uses a car, you know, in a felony, and someone gets killed perhaps even, unless there's some liability because of malfunction or things of that nature. The rest of that, I think, is kind of parallel to what has happened in our country in regard to national defense and, for example, the extraction industries, mining. We have controlled mining to the point where we mine very little in the United States. As a result, we're dependent on foreign powers and foreign countries for a lot of the minerals and elements that we use in the defense industry. So I think what we have there is a parallel situation, that we don't want to push too much of our industry offshore when we need it home for not only domestic consumption, but also defense consumption.
So in relation to that, talking about whether it be gun ownership or manufacturing, or what we're talking about other natural resources, if we depend on other countries, and even though they might be friendly at a certain time and they might reverse and have an unfriendly government, is that a threat to national security?
I certainly believe it could be, because you don't build up a huge stockpile in this day and age, because you can't afford to do that. And you know, even the issues of quality control, it's a lot better to know your supplier locally within your own country rather than being subjected to imports from overseas.
Since that is our topic today, is dealing with the Second Amendment and this process. Again, he spoke to our audience in March. We're taping this in early April. It'll air in August, so things may happen in Congress. But other than what the senator spoke to concerning the possibility of a law that would make the manufacturers liable, is there any other pending legislation in relation to the Second Amendment that Senator Craig is watching in this session?
Not really, Tony. That's the only thing. He's working on a broad range of legislation, but this is the only specific one that relates to the Second Amendment and gun ownership.
Mm-hmm. So we have a little time left, not a whole lot. Maybe we'll just shift gears a little bit,
okay.
Because there's something else that's very much on the front burner, and that has to do with the proposal to extend the Patriot Act, which portions of it, not all, but portions will expire on the last day of December. And Senator Craig is one of the key leaders in the Senate that has introduced legislation, and it may have made some progress by the time this airs, but to support the extension of the Patriot Act, but only with changes. From your discussions with the senator, how do you think that that's going to unfold? I know there's a lot of members in the Senate of the Democratic Party and key Republican senators like Senator Craig, and like the senior senator from Illinois is working with Senator Craig. I believe I heard some testimony before the Judiciary Committee. What kind of prediction do you have about could the president succeed in getting it through without any changes?
By the time people are viewing this in August, they could really second guess us pretty easily. But I think by the time the folks see this, we'll have seen the Patriot Act extended with those changes. Not only Senator Craig, but as you know, our Congressman Butch Otter is leading the charge in the House to make some changes to the Patriot Act that really, again, protect personal freedoms, while at the same time allowing law enforcement agencies to pursue their war against terrorism.
And this proposed change has come under a new term. In modern times, almost all legislation has a rather catchy name, and I believe this one is going to be called the SAFE Act,
the
or
SAFE Act.
Amendment.
SAFE Act, yes, the SAFE Act. And to tell you the truth, that the House is using a little bit different wording than the Senate, but the acronym is still the same. And it doesn't really take a whole lot of steam out of the Patriot Act, except to put judicial review back in the process. And it's not like we don't trust the people who work for the Attorney General. We don't cast aspersions toward law enforcement whatsoever. But we don't know what will happen in the future. So we want to make sure that it's a good law that's passed now that allows our law enforcement folks and the judiciary to do what they need to do to pursue terrorists.
What's intriguing about this from a political viewpoint is that oftentimes when you have a piece of legislation, it's permanent until it gets changed. And so if the Congress, in its wisdom, a majority decides they want to propose changes in the law that the president will agree with, the president can simply veto it and the old law stays in place. That's not the situation. So if both houses of Congress passed some changes and the president vetoed them, and it would put the president in a difficult position of letting this expire, or portions of it. So what I'm trying to say is, doesn't this give Congress quite strong leverage in these negotiations?
Well, if I were in the administration, I would say it would be an unfair advantage for Congress. But from our point of view, it's just part of our system of checks and balances. Mm-hmm. And I think it was wise when they crafted the original Patriot Act to allow some of these provisions to sunset or to have an expiration date. And I think that was key to getting it passed as quickly as it went through, that it would get a review, and we would have the chance again to look at it and to see if it's needed.
My other understanding of the SAFE Act is that the way it's been crafted is that it addresses some of the provisions that are going to sunset, but it also addresses some provisions that we're not going to sunset. So it's a much more comprehensive look at the entire law.
It is, and the Senate version of the SAFE Act is a little bit more broad than the House of Representatives, and we anticipate, and your viewers now are saying, well, you're right or wrong at this point, that both will pass, and then they'll go to conference like they always do, and somewhere in between will be what will be the modifications to the Patriot Act.
But again, when you're counting noses, and some members of Congress are really good at that, we're off at a distance, but it appears to me that there's I don't see that there are the votes there to renew it in its present form. It just seems like that there's a coalition that there will be some changes.
I believe so, absolutely.
Yeah. And finally, for those who'd like to get in touch with the senator, would you like to give them a number?
Absolutely. We have an office right here in Coeur d'Alene, one of the 5 regional offices in the state, and we're at 208-667-6130.
For those who might not have got that down, I'll repeat it for you.
Thank you.
At the office here in North Idaho, it's area code 208-667-6130. And of course, you're in the directory. And
we certainly are. In every community, yes.
Yes, right. Both Democrats and Republican senators and representatives have regional offices, which is very helpful to getting in touch with the people. John Martin, the regional director for Senator Larry Craig in North Idaho, thank you for being with us, and thank you for all the cooperation enabling us to have the message from the senator during our week on Hot Talk, and we hope you'll be back at some future time.
I certainly hope so, and thank you, Professor Stewart.
Ladies and gentlemen, we very much enjoyed this 10-week series with you. It's a very fascinating subject, and we'll change to another issue next week. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.